What's up? Is your lease about to expire? With some effort, Luke managed to swallow down his forkful of noodles and spoke with his mouth half full. No wonder I don't remember seeing you around. You're not often at school, are you? Joseph nodded. No, not very often. Mays University had a Hall of Fame. Being a top-notch school, there was naturally a whole throng of alumni. If someone's name could be displayed in the Hall of Fame and become a part of the school's history, it was an honor in and of itself. Joseph's portrait had already been placed in the law school's Hall of Fame for a few years now. His portrait was surrounded by fellow Hall of Famers, all of whom were old or middle-aged. The portrait was painted with an odd but very unique and distinctive style. He was, without a doubt, the youngest person in the Hall of Fame. He was also the one who had died the earliest. The portrait had probably been moved to the Hall of Fame for the deceased by now to be used as a mourning portrait. One shouldn't think too hard about these kinds of things. It was easy to get a stomachache just thinking about it. In short, as a member of the Hall of Fame, his life had been plentiful as well as extremely busy. Although he had held the title of dean and had stayed in a spacious office designed to his tastes, he actually hadn't spent all that much time within Mays University itself. Normally, he would only stay at the school for a few days to take care of any important matters that arose in the university or the law school. And while he was at it, he would set aside a bit of time to piss off his students. Or rather, piss off one particular student. When he wasn't at the university, he was at Southcross Law Firm. He was rarely in his own home. This had actually been the butt of a joke at one point. 6 years ago, when Dekarma underwent a reform, everyone's personal records had to be registered and confirmed a second time. Of course, this wasn't like the olden days, so these kinds of records didn't have to be entered into the system word by word. It was generated based on things such as asset card usage and was automatically analyzed. The registration process only required a quick glance and an in-person signature as confirmation. One of the items included in the personal records file was principal residence. The system would determine the location based on how long you stayed in a particular spot, and automatically filtered by length of time and frequency. When Joseph had gone to the records office for the confirmation, the data for the principal residence column had rippled past, and in the end, 4 words had popped up. Long-distance space shuttle. The young woman in charge of the file had laughed so hard she fell off her chair. No matter how graceful of an expression that frequent flyer, Professor Yen tried to maintain, it couldn't hide the fact that his face had turned green. However, it still couldn't compare to the green in his face at the present moment. Joseph removed his earpiece and played with it in his hand. He gave the message from the apartment another silent look. His lease was ending tomorrow, which meant that he definitely had to move out today. Of course, all his worldly belongings could fit into the pocket of his coat, so there was no need to physically move anything. The important part was that he still had to find a new place to stay for the time being. He had $5,022 in total, and if he excluded expenses for food and travel, where could he even afford to live? You haven't found a new place yet? Anna surmised. She sat across from him, and because of the angle of the holographic screen, other people were unable to see its contents. Of course, she wasn't in the habit of peeping at other people's messages, and was only asking out of concern when she noticed that Joseph hadn't touched the rest of his lunch. Joseph raised his head and smiled softly. I'm looking for one right now. Why don't you live at school? Luke suggested. Our dormitory is pretty close to Southcross, and it's subsidized during our internship period. This subsidy was one of the law school's specialties. Every year, during the internship period, the law school would set aside some funds to give to students who made an honest effort during their internship. Its glorified name was intern scholarship, but was usually known as a subsidy. It also had a nickname that was rather long and was called, "We know you interns don't have money and are dirt poor, so we'll hand out a bit of cash to save your life." Truthfully, it wasn't a whole lot. It was paid monthly and was about $30 a day, and was just enough to cover transportation costs, with maybe a smidgen left over. Meat from a mosquito is still meat, Luke said, praising the subsidy. Joseph thought mentally. Thanks for reminding me. I don't even get to eat mosquito meat. He was a poor imitation of a student. Counterfeit goods, if you will. And could probably keep up the pretense at the law firm. If he were to go to school, he would be a sitting duck just waiting to give the game away. He was afraid that he might end up walking down his usual path and head straight through the door to the dean's office. Besides, did the school have files related to the explosion case? Nope. That afternoon, Joseph remained the sole occupant and beneficiary of the spacious office. Garrett evidently wasn't in the habit of disclosing his whereabouts before heading out, so Joseph had no idea where he had gone, and whether or not he would return to the office today. Even if he didn't return, Joseph wouldn't be surprised. After all, he himself used to have a similar lifestyle. The file folder had been collapsed into a few thin sheets and didn't look like such an eyesore. However, Joseph wasn't in a rush to organize it. Instead, he first searched up the words explosion case in the folder. The computer let out a jingle and all the information related to explosion case were pulled up. Page after page of documents were stacked in front of Joseph. It really was rather useful, but weren't there way too many fucking pages? What's more, it was obvious that it wasn't just one explosion case. There must have been at least 5 cases, if not more. Joseph folded his arms and leaned heavily against the back of the chair. He was so pissed that he was about to burst out laughing. Did Southcross Law Firm do nothing else but pick out all sorts of explosion cases to take on? Ryan? While Joseph's head was still pounding, Luke knocked on the door. He stuck his head inside and glanced around, looking as if he were some sort of robber. Why don't you pull a ski mask over your face first, then come back? When the esteemed Professor Yan was in a foul mood, he would start mocking people with a smile on his face. The target of his mockery let out a laugh and entered. You're too funny. Not as funny as you, evidently. Professor Gu still hasn't come back? Luke stepped gingerly into the office. He didn't understand why the 2 female students wanted to work in this office. In any case, the very sight of Professor Gu's icy expression, which was basically a static photograph, was enough to instill fear in him, even before being acquainted. If he was back, would you still have the guts to come inside? Joseph's jab was as effective as a needle that drew blood with a single jab. No, I wouldn't dare. He seems even harder to get close to than my teacher, Luke replied, his mouth twitching. His teacher was called Hobbs and had silver hair, eagle-like eyes, and a thin frame. He was a veteran lawyer that had an elite sort of temperament. However, when it came to icy expressions, he was still no match for Garrett. How's your file organization coming along? I did something stupid, Luke said. What happened? My hand slipped and I dragged a document into the permanent delete bin. What document? Joseph still hadn't shown a reaction. You haven't seen it yet? Luke used his fingers to draw the outline of a square. It was a document like this. It specified what order the files should be organized in, and which documents go first. Oh, that list? Joseph said. He straightened in his hair and swiped his finger to look through his own files. I didn't see it yet. It's not a big deal even if it's permanently deleted. Just ask your teacher to send you another copy. Luke laughed dryly. My teacher? No, I'm scared. Besides, he left the office, Luke added, so as not to seem so terrified. He doesn't seem to like me very much. He said he's going to see the client but didn't bring me along. Joseph said consolingly, Don't worry about it. At least he told you why he was heading out. My teacher didn't even look at me before he left. Also, they normally don't bring interns with them on the first day, Professor Yan said lightly. To the intern, it's like suddenly picking a fight for the whole day, and to the lawyer, it's an added headache to deal with. Both sides have to keep their cool. It actually made a bit of sense. I found it. Joseph's search had pulled up the documents that listed items such as file cover, table of contents, engagement letter, etc. in order. Right, that's the one. All right, you can head back. I'll send a copy directly to your computer, Joseph said. Luke expressed his eternal gratitude, and for a moment Joseph wondered if he hadn't actually sent a document and had, instead, sent $1 million. Although each lawyer's office at Southcross Law Firm was independent, the fact that they shared the same management and human resources department meant that there was a custom communication system set up for internal purposes. Joseph looked up Luke's name on the list and sent him the document. He was about to close the window, but from the corner of his eye, he noticed Garrett's name on the list. The status symbol next to his name indicated that he could be reached. The esteemed Professor Yen stared at it for 2 seconds, then suddenly had an idea. He raised a brow, opened up Garrett's window and sent a message. "Lawyer Gu, are we allowed to stay overnight at the office?" The esteemed Professor Yen, who hadn't suffered shortages of funds in ages, had planned it all out. Since his lease was ending and he hadn't found a new home that was suitable, cheap and to his taste, then he may as well make do and spend the next few days at the office. It wasn't as if he hadn't spent nights at the office in the past when things got busy. One could even say that he had plenty of experience. However, there was no sign of activity for a while after the message was sent. Joseph stared at the screen and tried placating himself for a bit, but was unable to suppress his temper in the end. He sent out another line. "Lawyer Gu." After about a minute, there was finally a sound indicating a new notification. Joseph lifted his gaze. Garrett hadn't said a single word and had directly sent over a screenshot. What the hell? Joseph tapped it open and realized that the image was from the internship manual. It contained a line from the manual that said, "Note on etiquette. Interns should address their mentor as teacher." The single sentence was like a half-assed attempt at an execution. The cut was far from clean, and the head was still attached. It was clear that Garrett's reply was just for show, and he had probably pulled something out offhandedly and sent it over. The esteemed Professor Yen smiled as he looked at the messaging screen and thought, "Teacher, a student like you must have balls of steel." He was struck speechless by the fact that his seniority had been thrown into disorder. Although his mouth wasn't able to move, his hands were still functioning. Joseph chortled, then gave the holographic screen a few jabs as he typed his third message to the balls of steel Garrett. "All right then. Professor Gu, I want to stay overnight at the office." This time the reply came within moments, and Garrett typed as if every single letter was more precious than gold. Reason being, how could Joseph tell his own student something as absurd as to avoid sleeping on the streets? Even if said student didn't act like a student at all. However, Joseph gave it some thought and felt that he still wanted to save face this time, so he bullshitted a reply. "To work overtime, have to organize files." Garrett didn't respond for a long time. He had probably been struck dumb by Joseph's fighting spirit. A minute later, Garrett responded, "Work overtime at home." The esteemed Professor Yen was so livid, he leaned into the back of his chair once more. "Screw you. If I had a home, would I have to work overtime in the first place?" His greatest regret in life was that he had taught such an unlucky bastard like Garrett. It had been years since Garrett had graduated, and yet he still managed to add to Joseph's stress levels with pinpoint accuracy. Fortunately, this type of rage didn't persist for very long. That evening, the messaging screen that Joseph had slammed shut came back to life. There was a new message from Garrett. "Come to Port Nusa at 6 o'clock. Joseph lazily sent a reply. "To do what? Business trip." Just that afternoon, Joseph had told Luke that law firms normally wouldn't require interns to work out of the office on their first day. Who would have thought that mere hours late, Garrett would make an exception to the rule? What business trip? To where? This time, Garrett didn't give him the silent treatment and quickly replied, "Wine City." Wine City? Joseph almost forgot to breathe when he saw the name. Wine City wasn't exactly a city per se. Whenever people mention it, they usually meant the planet in the Tianqin system. It was a dumpster sort of planet, full of swindlers, hoodlums, and nasty characters. In short, it was a planet that carried a certain kind of odor, a moldy sort of smell, that could make one choke and stumble, even if one was several light years away. Of course, there was a city called Wine City on this planet. Wine City was the capital. So no matter how it was interpreted, the words left little room for comfort. Rather than ask him to go to such a planet, you may as well loop some rope around his neck, hang it from the window and put an end to his misery. Joseph didn't even bother to think before replying simply, "Not going." "Head hurts just looking at the name, I'm not going." Joseph rubbed at his temples. After a few seconds of silence, Garrett replied, "If I recall correctly, you're a newly hired intern. And yet you seem to think of yourself as a high-level partner. Have I gone mad or have you?" The mockery in the response was almost stifling. However, Joseph was forced to admit that this was the sad reality, a reality that he always seemed to be forgetting. The esteemed Professor Yan moved his lips, then said self-mockingly, "I do apologize, I must have forgotten my manners." He moved his fingers and was about to reply when Garrett sent over 2 screenshots. The first was from the intern manual. Business trips will be subsidized based on the duration of the trip, with payments totaling $120 per day. The second was also from the intern manual. Interns whose performance is level C or lower will have their remuneration deducted accordingly. "And so he giveth and he taketh. You sure have grown, O student of mine." A famous professor once said, "Anyone that attempts to use money to threaten the poor was no better than a beast." The aforementioned famous professor gave up and replied, I'll go right now. By the way, carrying the intern's manual with you while you're on the go must have been hard on you. Don't you find it tiring, Professor Gu?" Garrett didn't reply, probably because he couldn't be bothered. That evening, Joseph found himself standing in the entry hall of Port Nusa. This was Dakarma's transportation hub. The port had 12 lanes that were filled with an uninterrupted stream of space shuttles and spaceships from morning to night. Space shuttles were both convenient and fast, and were always allowed to travel on the shortest interstellar lines. It was suitable for commercial travel, but the downside was the frequent line transfers and jump drives, so it wasn't ideal for those with weak constitutions. The route taken by spaceships were a little more romantic. It was stable, relaxed, and more appropriate for excursionists. For people like Joseph and Garrett, they were basically resigned to space shuttle travel for life. The temperature at night was lower compared to day, so Joseph flipped up the collar of his black coat. He stuck his hands in his pockets, eyes sweeping his surroundings. He happened to catch sight of Garrett in the middle of the crowd. Garrett lifted his finger a little to indicate his location. What a truly conspicuous gesture. If someone's eyesight was even a little bit faulty, they'd probably have to look around for another year. Joseph shook his head and said irritably. His lips were slightly parted, and the white fog of his exhale dissipated before his face, partially obscuring his features. When he finally reached Garrett, he realized that Garrett was gazing at him with a slight furrow in his brows. "What are you looking at?" "It's nothing." Garrett withdrew his gaze, pulled out his smart device and scanned the screen. With a disapproving tone, he said, "Did you just get here? Didn't you say 6 o'clock?" Joseph casually withdrew a hand from his pocket and pointed flippantly with a thin finger at the display screen in the entry hall. "It's 6 o'clock on the dot, not a second later. What's the problem? Did you use your face and not your ears to listen during your negotiation class?" Garrett strode further inside the great hall. As he turned, the hem of his gray wool coat lifted to reveal his perfectly tailored shirt. "Didn't you learn about the golden 10-minute rule?" The golden 10-minute rule suggested that someone who arrived 10 minutes early to an appointment had a psychological edge over someone that bordered on being late. Before you even open your mouth, you would have established yourself in a higher position, because the other party would usually start off by apologizing for having arrived later. Joseph was familiar with the concept, and it was a lesson that he himself had requested to be added to the course. However, he personally didn't put this theory to practice. The reason was very simple. As long as he wasn't late, even if he arrived a mere second before the agreed-upon time, he didn't feel the least bit apologetic, even if the other party had been waiting for a full 10 minutes. It is what it is, and there was no need to think twice about it. He called it mastery of the basics of psychology. Garrett would probably call it shameless. I listened to the entire lesson and then tossed it. Joseph caught up to him and spoke unhurriedly. If I arrive early, the other party owes me. If I'm late, then I owe the other party. Rather than worry about appearances or oppression, I prefer to call it even. Besides, how many people out there would dare pressure me? Joseph thought. Keep dreaming. It wasn't just a thought that he kept to himself, he shamelessly put it into practice. After the two of them passed through ticket inspection and took their seats inside the space shuttle, Joseph touched his ring and then tapped a few times on the holographic screen. Garrett's ring vibrated. Did you send something? Garrett's smart device was a ring as well. It had a simple and stylish design and was worn on the little finger of his right hand. At first glance, it looked like an extremely fitting tail ring that went well with his pale and slender hand. However, it was apparent that he was none too pleased with the sudden quiver of his ring. Or perhaps it was purely because the message was from a particularly annoying intern. What's this, a bus ticket? Garrett shot a glance at the message he had received. It was an electronic ticket. Joseph leaned back and adjusted his seat, replying calmly, It's the transportation cost for traveling to Port Nusa. I'm submitting it for reimbursement.